Good afternoon, everyone. Archivist of the United States David Ferriero was supposed to make the opening remarks for today's program, but unfortunately he's been called out of town on business. So on behalf of the Archivist of the United States, I'd like to welcome all of you and our good friends from C-SPAN to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum, as well as the producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to mention a couple other programs that will be taking place at this location. Thursday, May 17th at 7 p.m., we'll present a panel discussion, Before the Freedom Riders, the Fight to Integrate Glen Echo Amusement Park. This program will also include clips of a new documentary film, Ain't No Back to a Merry-Go-Round, which is going to be released in 2019. Then on Tuesday, May 22nd at noon, Donald Rumsfeld will be here to discuss his book, When the Center Held, Gerald Ford and the Rescue of the American Presidency, and offer us a behind-the-scenes look at life in the Oval Office during the administration of Gerald Ford. To find out more about these programs, our exhibits, please visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. You'll also find some printed materials about upcoming events in the theater lobby. Our topic for today is World War II at Sea, A Global History, by acclaimed naval historian Craig L. Symonds. It is being brought to you in partnership with our good friends at the United States Navy Memorial. To introduce our guest speaker is the President and CEO of the Navy Memorial, Rear Admiral Frank Thorpe.
Thank you, Doug, and welcome to the Archives. It is truly my honor today to be able to introduce Dr. Craig Symonds, a person who I have known since I came into the Navy service in 1977, and with a long and distinguished career of naval expertise, being a naval enthusiast, and expertise about the Navy. Currently, Dr. Symonds is the Ernest J. King Distinguished Professor of Maritime History at the Naval War College, which is a very proud chair to be in. But more importantly to me, Professor Symonds was a professor of history at the Naval Academy, is now a professor of history emeritus. He taught for 30 years and served as a chair of the history department. And I live in Annapolis now, and I try to stay in touch with things going on at the Naval Academy. And I will tell you the most important thing I can tell you about Dr. Symonds today is not his incredible knowledge and passion for the service and the country, but he has a reputation of being a teacher who is much loved by the midshipmen at the Naval Academy. Now, I was one for 4 years, and there are not many professors that get that reputation from a very cynical group of 4,000 young men and women who are the top of their game. And I will tell you that I spoke to several people, and to a person, the glow of the reputation of Dr. Symonds was very clear. I spoke to a couple of professors, and one of them described Professor Symonds as the best of colleagues. Not a bad thing to be described as, the best of colleagues. Another professor said, quote, a great lecturer, dynamic, engaging, passionate, challenging, and inviting, all at the same time. And another professor described Dr. Symonds as highly influential leader in the history department, setting a high bar for everyone in teaching, scholarship, and service. As you all know from your program, he's the author of countless military history books, many of them Navy. And I want to touch on them and focus on the awards. I'm going to read them fast because to a guy like me, each of them are important, but in total is what is so impressive. He's written Decision at Sea, 5 Naval Battles That Shaped American History, which won the Theodore and Franklin Delano Roosevelt Prize. Lincoln and His Admirals, Abraham Lincoln, the U.S. Navy, and the Civil War, which won the Lincoln Prize, the Barrondas Prize, the Laney Prize, the Lyman Prize, and the Abraham Lincoln Institute Book Award. Other works include Civil War at Sea, the U.S. Navy, and others. And most recent books are on the Second World War, notably the Battle of Midway, which we will commemorate the anniversary here on June 5th. and Neptune, the Allied invasion of Europe and the D-Day landings, which won the Berry Prize and Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize. And Dr. Symonds doesn't always write about the Navy, sadly. No, he is quite a historian, having written about the Battle of Gettysburg as well as General Johnston and others. But Dr. Symonds is really a Navy guy, having a significant impact on the men and women who have served in the Navy for the last 3 or 4 decades and will serve for decades more. As a matter of fact, his historical atlas of the U.S. Navy is still in use in the core naval history class at the Naval Academy today. His impact on the Navy has been simply immense. Along with all the books and the numerous awards, Dr. Symonds has also received the Navy Meritorious Civilian Service Award and the Navy Superior Civilian Service Award not once, not twice, but 3 times. And he's a veteran. He served as a lieutenant in the early 70s. So I have to say, as the CEO of the Navy Memorial across the street here, our mission is to honor, recognize, and celebrate the men and women of the sea services, past, present, and future, and to inform the public about their service. So today, Dr. Symonds, I would like to ask the audience here to join me as we honor, recognize, and celebrate you for everything you have done to inform us about the United States Navy. But before I turn over the microphone to you, I have a quick sea story that I think the audience will enjoy. Dr. Symonds is, in fact, a true naval enthusiast, but he's not only a great professor and an engaging author and a true naval enthusiast, but he has been played by a character on the silver screen that you may not know about. And I have to admit, when I talked to him earlier, he did not want me to tell this story, so I am violating his request. But not bad to be played by none other than Harrison Ford, also known as Jack Ryan. If you recall in the movie Patriot Games, Jack Ryan is giving a lecture on Thucydides, as Dr. Symonds frequently does. And the filmmakers, when they came to the Naval Academy, they asked for a professor that Harrison Ford could follow around to give them an idea of what Harrison Ford would do. Now remember, Harrison Ford had been over in the UK, he'd been a CIA agent, he was a former naval officer, and as I understand it, the Naval Academy leadership said, you have got to follow Dr. Symonds around. So the filmmakers appropriated his office, they appropriated his classroom, and they appropriated his class. And although he denies it, I think we've seen his face in that movie. So ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Symonds' newest book, and what he's here to talk about today, is World War II at Sea, A Global History. It is my honor, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce to you today Dr. Craig Symonds.
Well, nobody can live up to that introduction, for crying out loud. Thank you, Admiral. I appreciate that very much. I want to tell a quick story as well about just how incendiary this book is. You need to know this because I spoke this morning over at the Treasury Institute on I Street in Washington. And they had ordered a number of copies of the book, 3 boxes full, as I understand, and had them sent down to the Institute for distribution to their audience. And when they arrived without insufficient specificity in terms of their intended audience. It was a general address rather than a specific individual listed on the address label. So this being a government institution, very well guarded with the usual screeners at the door, these 3 packages arrived, looking very suspicious. And I am not making this up, this absolutely happened. And so they were sequestered and surrounded by C4 and blown to smithereens. Now, I've had bad reviews before, but never one quite like that. Well, I appreciate your being here today on a beautiful day outside, giving that up to listen to me talk about World War II. And I want to begin by making perhaps a challenging statement, and that World War II was the most gruesome, traumatic, transformative event in all of human history. It literally changed the world. And for many Americans of my generation, and perhaps yours as well, it became the template of what we think of as war itself. That assumption, I'm put to you, is not correct. In fact, of all the wars fought in world history, World War II was virtually unique. It had a very specific beginning. It was fought by mobilizing almost the entire population of the countries that were involved. The foe was unrelievedly evil. I know there's an effort by propaganda ministers in every conflict to paint your foe as an evil enemy, but in this particular case, it was absolutely the truth. And it ended with what FDR famously called unconditional surrender. For the generation that lived it or remembers it, there's a tendency to measure other wars by that standard, by that template. And because wars since then have lacked the clarity and decisiveness of World War II, it has led to frustration and public unrest. In fact, however, World War II was not the template of war. It's the only war that meets all of those conditions. Now, I'm going to talk this afternoon about the naval side of that war, which was quite literally a global conflict. And in trying to cover all of it in a single book or in a single talk is somewhat challenging, a little bit humbling as well. And that said, I'll give it my best shot. For Americans, World War II began on December 7th, 1941. But for the British, the French, the Germans, and especially the Polish, it began 2 years earlier on September 1st, 1939. And for the Japanese and Chinese, it began 2 years before that on July 7th, 1937. And in my book, I try to honor all of these participants. My goal, after all, was to write about World War II at sea. All of it, including those theaters Americans do not pay much attention to as a rule: the Indian Ocean, the Barents Sea, the Mediterranean until 1943. The most famous book about the war at sea is this one, and rightly so. In 1941, Samuel Eliot Morison was a professor of history at Harvard University with half a dozen very good books under his belt, including a classic biography of Christopher Columbus. And when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Morison took himself to the White House and asked the president for a commission as a naval officer so he could go to sea, travel with the Navy, and record that war for posterity as it was happening. He saw a lot of action as a lieutenant commander and later as a reserve rear admiral, so that it's possible to refer to him as both Professor Morison and Admiral Morison. And as I say, he saw a lot of action in that role. He was on board the cruiser Brooklyn during the invasion of North Africa. He was on aircraft carriers during several of the iconic battles in the Pacific. He watched the landings at Okinawa. He also had other officers who sent him information, eyewitness accounts from other sources, so that he put together, after the war in the early 1950s, a 15-volume history of World War II at sea, which he supervised as kind of general editor. And because some readers were daunted by taking on a 15-volume work, he later authored a 1-volume version, which is the one here. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm here to flog my book, not Morison's. So let me explain how mine is different. Note the title of Morison's book. He says it was a two-ocean war, one that took place in the Atlantic, where much of the confrontation was between the transatlantic convoys to Britain and Hitler's wolf pack of U-boats, and in the Pacific, where the action was marked by those gigantic carrier battles and by the amphibious operations from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. It is an excellent account of the role of the U.S. Navy in two oceans. But a total of 72 nations were belligerents in the Second World War, either voluntarily or in many cases involuntarily. And a dozen of those had substantial navies, navies important enough to have an impact on the trajectory and arguably even the outcome of the war. While the U.S. Navy was the largest, it was not the only one. Not only that, but in addition, the naval war was fought not in two oceans, but in at least 6, plus, of course, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, the Barents Sea, and other important bodies of water. And that sort of explains the subtitle of my book, which is A Global History. Because I wanted to deal with those theaters of war where American vessels seldom appeared. As Franklin Roosevelt said in the first of his famous fireside chats, the oceans of the world for this war constituted one gigantic battlefield. I also explore a bit about the culture and background and circumstances of those other participants in the war to illuminate their motives and objectives. All of these navies mattered, in no small part because they all shared a common resource base, especially for shipping. When national leaders had to construct a policy to fight this war, they had to take the entire globe into consideration, since committing resources to one theater necessarily meant not committing those resources to another theater. Here's a slide I'll let you wonder about for a moment. I put this up in honor of the so-called butterfly effect. You've probably heard of this. This is where a butterfly in one part of the world, supposedly flapping its wings, has an impact, small as it is, that over the large face of the globe changes circumstances in such a way that it might help spawn a typhoon in another part of the globe. I'm skeptical about the literal truth of that, but it is indisputable that committing ships and resources and manpower to one theater necessarily meant not committing them to a theater elsewhere. So that the global naval war between 1939 and 1945, and especially after the United States entered the war in 1941, illustrates this particular phenomenon. In 1942 in particular, there were demands for Allied resources everywhere. In the Atlantic against the U-boats, in the Pacific to slow down the Japanese, in the Arctic to bring supplies to the Soviet Union, the Red Army still bearing the brunt of the war against the German ground machine. In the Mediterranean, where the British were attempting to hold together the sea line of communication between Gibraltar and Suez. In the Indian Ocean, where a Japanese naval strike force, the same one that had attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, attacked the British naval forces in Ceylon and India and essentially drove them out of the Bay of Bengal. All those flapping butterfly wings meant that strategic decision makers could not pursue a single line of approach. They had to parcel out their scarce assets here and there, hoping that the world did not collapse on them entirely. Now, they did try to address these conflicts one at a time. This man is Harold Stark, who, as you can see, had the curious nickname of Betty. He came by that nickname when he was a plebe at the Naval Academy. In those days, less so now, I don't know if you had a nickname at the Naval Academy or not, but the tradition was in the 20s and 30s in particular that the upper class would give a nickname to the plebes as they came in, and often that nickname stayed with them for life. I remember when I was working as a flag lieutenant for a vice admiral in the early 1970s, I would help draft his letters, and of course I would begin Dear Admiral Jones, and I would bring them in for him to sign, and he'd look through it, but he'd cross out the salutation, Dear Admiral Jones, and write in, Dear Stinky. I always wondered how Stinky got his nickname. But we know how Stark got his nickname. He was standing in formation one day as a plebe when an upperclassman noticed his name tag on his uniform. Stark, he said, are you related to General John Stark? To which Midshipman 4th Class Stark answered, Sir, I do not know who General John Stark is, sir. Well, that was not the right answer. So the upperclassman informed him that General John Stark was a hero of the American Revolution who, prior to the Battle of Bennington, had told his men, we will win today or Betty Stark will be a widow. And he ordered Midshipman Stark to shout out that phrase every time he encountered an upperclassman throughout his plebe year. And the result was that virtually everyone called him Betty. This is a letter I just stuck in here for fun. This is a letter from the Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark in 1941. Can you read the salutation? Dear Betty. And that's not even the punchline. The punchline is that General John Stark's wife was named Molly. Well, be that as it may, Stark was Chief of Naval Operations, became Chief of Naval Operations on the 1st of August, 1939. August 1st, 1939, exactly 1 month before German troops crossed the Polish border to inaugurate World War II. His principal contribution to Allied strategy in the war was a memo that he wrote in November of 1940, after France had capitulated and the British were driven off the beaches at Dunkirk. It was, as a recent film suggests, the darkest hour. It looked very much like the Germans were going to win this war and the United States would be isolated in the Western Hemisphere. So given that, Stark laid out in a memo 4 options for American grand strategy. We could, he said, defend the Western Hemisphere. This was the goal of the isolationists who made up by far the vast majority of the American public. They'd had it with international wars. They thought World War I was a mistake. We don't want to get into another one, so let's hunker down and stay where we are. We could focus on a possible war with Japan. This, after all, had been the Navy's primary interest since about 1911. And for 40 years, really, the United States had focused on the defeat of Japan as the most likely foe in the future. Or third, we could try to fight in both oceans against both foes at the same time, though you really don't want to have to fight a 2-front war if you can avoid it. Or, option D, we could reorient our strategy program entirely and focus instead on the defeat of Germany first. That 4th option, Plan D or Plan Dog in Navy lingo, was the one that Franklin Roosevelt accepted. Germany, Roosevelt believed, was by far the more dangerous foe among the 3 axis, not only because of its perverse ideology and obvious aggression, the position it held in Europe after the fall of France in 1940, but also because of its economy. The gross domestic product of Germany in 1940 was greater than that of France and Britain combined, and 6 times bigger than that of Japan. So this is the real enemy. In Roosevelt's mind, it was essential to American national interest to defeat Germany first, to make sure that Britain survived so that its island could be used as a launching point for the eventual invasion of Europe and the suppression of Germany should it come to war. And most historians have followed suit. Germany first, treating the war as 2 connected, of course, but separate conflicts. A chapter on a war in Europe and then a chapter on the war in the Pacific. A 2-ocean war. That, however, is not the way it was fought. When American and British admirals and generals met, as they did several times, to hammer out Allied strategy for the war, they paid lip service to the concept of defeating Germany first. But the pressures were simultaneous. In 1942, as I suggested, the Anglo-American allies were like a boy standing in the shadow of a dam that was cracking and breaking in 12 or 13 places at the same time and trying to shore up the leaks and keep the dam from collapsing on top of them. So in addition to being a war that was fought by a dozen navies in 6 oceans, it was also a war that took place everywhere simultaneously. And let me try to demonstrate this by offering a few examples. In August of 1942, fairly early in the war still, a single reinforced U.S. Marine division splashed ashore on an island virtually no Americans had ever heard of called Guadalcanal, the tail end of the Solomon Island chain, there where the Blue Arrow is located, in the southern Pacific. That in itself is a violation of the Germany first principle, but Ernest King, who by now had replaced Stark as the American Chief of Naval Operations, argued that this isn't really going on the offensive in the Pacific, because Australian coast watchers had reported that the Japanese were building an airstrip on Guadalcanal, and if they completed that airstrip, it would allow them to interrupt the line of communications between Hawaii and Australia And if that happened, we would be in desperate straits. So this isn't really an offensive, King insisted. It's a defensive measure to prevent the Japanese from breaking our secure lines. Not entirely a bogus argument, though of course King knew full well that it would be the camel's nose under the tent, that if you started out in Guadalcanal, that initial division would have to be supported and supplied and reinforced until, like a black hole, Guadalcanal would suck resources and supplies and manpower into its vortex, which is exactly what happened. And there was another complication. To return to this map for a minute, you can see here that the Pacific theater is divided into two command areas by that blue line on the map. The reason the Americans did this was partly strategic. It is an enormous battlefield, so that logistically supplying all of it through one command is awkward, but mainly it's political. Franklin Roosevelt knew he had to give a command to Douglas MacArthur. But MacArthur was MacArthur. And the president did not want to give him command of the entire Pacific, nor did he want to give him control of the U.S. Navy. So, like King Solomon, he cut the baby in half. MacArthur got command of what was called the Southwest Pacific, or SOWESPAC, there at the lower left, which, as you can see, contained the continent of Australia, the Dutch East Indies, including the big islands of New Guinea, Borneo, and Sumatra, and, as far as MacArthur was concerned, the object of the whole campaign, the Philippine Islands. But everything else, all that blue space outside the Southwest Pacific, the Pacific Ocean area, this was to be under the command of Chester Nimitz, there on the left in this staged photograph. This, too, of course, is a violation of a strategic principle: don't divide your command in the face of an enemy. MacArthur complained about it constantly. He even suggested that Franklin Roosevelt had deliberately limited his command to a regional theater because Roosevelt feared that MacArthur was going to go out there and win that war and come back and run for president in 1944 and replace Roosevelt in the White House. And evidence suggests that MacArthur did in fact consider exactly that plan. But the decision stood, and so when the Marines went ashore on Guadalcanal to begin a 6-month campaign in the tropical jungles of that island, the United States confronted not 2 fronts in the Atlantic and the Pacific, but 3, having divided the Pacific into 2 commands, now fighting a 3-front war. The American landing on Guadalcanal was officially called Operation Watchtower, but so scarce were Allied resources in 1942 that almost everybody involved with it called it something else. They called it Operation Shoestring. And it very nearly fell apart the very next day. On the evening of August 8th, a Japanese surface force came down from Rabaul through what was called the slot, in those parallel lines of islands that characterize the Solomon Islands chain, came down through the slot to attack Allied warships, Australian and American, protecting the landing beach at Guadalcanal. The result was the most lopsided American defeat at sea since Pearl Harbor, or ever, including Pearl Harbor. 4 Allied cruisers went to the bottom, and the Japanese escaped utterly unscathed. It led to a lot of hand-wringing and finger-pointing in the United States, but it could have been worse. After their victory, instead of continuing on to the landing site to sink the American transport ships off the beach, the Japanese headed back to their base at Rabaul, satisfied with what they had accomplished. Had they attacked those transports, had they continued on past their victory to defeat the transport ships, it would have not only undercut the Guadalcanal operation, but Allied operations worldwide, because a shortage of shipping was the key bottleneck in Allied planning in 1942. Operation Shoestring, remember? Now, with those butterfly wings flapping in the Pacific, let me zoom literally halfway around the world to another island, this one in the Mediterranean. Far less known to American audiences than Guadalcanal, Malta was nevertheless a crucial British outpost smack dab in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Its location made it essential to the British sea lines of communication east to west, Gibraltar to Suez, and Axis naval communications north to south, from Italy into North Africa. And because it provided protection for British convoys and was a thorn in the side to Axis convoys from its principal harbor at Valletta, the Allies quite naturally tried to take it out. They did so from the air. And here's a statistic that's somewhat astonishing. More bombs were dropped on Valletta, on the island of Malta, in April of 1942 than all the bombs that were dropped on London throughout the Blitz in World War II. They hammered that place. In fact, by midsummer, it was in such extremis that rations for the population there had been reduced to 6 ounces of food per person per week. The Spitfires were virtually out of gas. The governor of the island notified London that if he didn't get a supply convoy in the next week, he would have to capitulate. And so they put together, the British put together a convoy from Glasgow consisting of 14 transports and one absolutely essential oil tanker, the ship that had been the Ohio. It was a Texas oil company, Texaco tanker, that had shown up in Glasgow with a load of aviation fuel, exactly what the Spitfires needed, and Churchill cabled Roosevelt personally to beg that it be turned over to the Royal Navy for this operation. Roosevelt, of course, agreed. The American crew went off, a British merchant marine crew came on board, and the Ohio joined the convoy to the south. And an argument can be made, well, I guess I'm going to make it right now, that the Ohio was the single most important ship afloat in the world in August of 1942. If that cargo of aviation fuel did not make it to Malta, the Spitfires would be grounded, the island would fall, the Axis would control the Mediterranean, and that would be the end of that theater. Dubbed Operation Pedestal, the convoy set out in the first week of August. First week of August, the same week the Marines went ashore in Guadalcanal, halfway around the world. The Pedestal convoy had the largest escort of any convoy during the entire war. 2 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, and 32 destroyers, all to protect 14 transports and a tanker. The escort force for Operation Pedestal was bigger than either of the operational forces that fought one another at Midway in June of 1942. It's a testimony to not only the importance of Malta, but the scarcity and value of transport shipping to the Allies in 1942. Well, the convoy entered the Mediterranean on August 10th, and over the next 6 days, as it steamed toward Malta, it was attacked literally every one of those days by aircraft from Sardinia, surface ships from Italy, German U-boats. The convoy escort force lost 2 carriers, 4 cruisers, several destroyers, and 9 of the 14 transports. Far worse than Allied losses off Guadalcanal in the Pacific. But 4 of the transports, and critically the tanker Ohio, remained afloat, though barely. The Ohio was bombed repeatedly, torpedoed as well, and remarkably, we actually have a photograph of the moment the torpedo struck the Ohio. In addition to that, several near misses by German bombs buckled her hull plates. 1 bomber shot down by AA fire crashed into her superstructure, and pieces of it hung there like a discordant Christmas ornament straddling her bridge. Not long afterward, another bomb penetrated the Ohio's deck and exploded in the engine room. Without power now, low in the water, taking on water rapidly, the Ohio appeared doomed. To keep her afloat, 2 British destroyers came alongside and lashed themselves port and starboard to this ship to literally hold her afloat and push her along at about 3 knots. More bombers arrived. One bomb hit her amidships and broke her back. The destroyers, however, kept her afloat, nudging her along at about 3 knots. With her decks awash, her back broken, no engine, no steering, no compass, and with pieces of a German bomber hanging in her superstructure, she stayed afloat just long enough to make it into Valletta Harbor, where cheering crowds lined the waterfront and a band played Rule Britannia. Malta remained in British hands for the rest of the war. Now, my point in telling you this story is not only because it's a cool story, one that few Americans know much about, but also to illustrate in a particularly dramatic way how global this war was. The war did not proceed separately in the Atlantic and the Pacific, or the Mediterranean for that matter. It took place everywhere and all at once, and again underscores just how precarious the state of Allied shipping was in that difficult summer of 1942. The 18 transports at Guadalcanal that the Japanese missed, the 14 that were involved in Operation Pedestal in the Mediterranean, formed a pool of shipping resources so limited that it restricted what the Allies could do. This particular problem would gradually go away, especially because of American shipbuilding capability. This is most evident in the Battle of the Atlantic between German U-boats and Allied convoys. You can see in this chart how the number of ships built by the Allies, and mostly by the United States, over 90% by the United States, the columns in red, grew exponentially through 1942 and 1943, while the number of ships sunk by German U-boats, the columns in black, declined in those same years. So new technology, better escorts, better protocols in the convoys allowed us to fend off the U-boats, but it was shipbuilding in the United States that really allowed the Allies to get ahead of this issue. We outbuilt them. We built ships faster than the submarines could sink them. Here's a particularly dramatic illustration of this. I like this photograph. This is a building way in the Bethlehem Fairfield shipyard in Baltimore in April of 1943. April of 43 is when the acceleration of American shipbuilding really takes off. The men are setting up the wooden framing for the keel of a new Liberty ship, a transport ship. I call your attention to the headgear. What would OSHA have to say about men wearing fedoras instead of hard hats in the workplace? Well, here's some other images of that same ship. This is day 1 we're looking at. Here's day 2. That's a lot of progress in one day. They're working in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. That's one reason why. Here's day 6, day 10, day 14, day 24, ready for launch. And there she goes. The very next day, men would lay the keel of another Liberty ship. In December 1942, the production of new shipping in American shipyards surpassed 1 million deadweight tons for the first time, and it went up from there. After that, it didn't matter how many ships those U-boats sunk in the North Atlantic. Well, obviously it mattered to the men on the ships and the supplies that they carried, but it would not avail the Germans of their strategic goal, which was to cut the vital lifeline to Britain. They could never get ahead of American production. With this dramatic infusion of maritime assets, the Allies went on the offensive, on the initiative in 1943, and they never let go of it. Here's another example of how World War II at sea was a global phenomenon. Just as most of you have heard of Guadalcanal, I suspect all of you have heard of D-Day. Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks probably had a lot to do with the fact that a new generation of Americans have been introduced to the horrors of Omaha Beach and the D-Day landings. But the naval armada that carried Tom Hanks and his men to the beach provided naval gunfire support, and most importantly, not only carried them to the beach, but kept them reinforced and resupplied, and the armada necessary to do that was unprecedented in size. Counting armed landing craft, those ships numbered over 6,000 hulls. And they had to operate for months. The invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe did not consist of a rush onto the beach on June 6, 1944. A total of 132,000 Allied soldiers went ashore that day, but 132,000 men are not going to drive to Paris and to Berlin and conquer the Wehrmacht. Eventually, tens of thousands, hundreds of millions would come ashore, and almost all of them and their supplies and their equipment and the tanks and the jeeps and the planes and the trucks and the fuel that kept them moving all came by sea. All that had to cross the English Channel in ships, and by and large, a lot of it came in a particular kind of ship that was known as the Landing Ship Tank, or LST. The sailors, by the way, who served on board these awkward vessels claimed that LST actually stood for Large Slow Target. They were indeed large. Their commodious hold could accommodate 20 Sherman tanks, 30 2.5-ton trucks, the famous Deuce and a Half, fully loaded, 40 jeeps, another 30 jeeps or artillery pieces up on the weather deck. And since ground combat in World War II had very clearly meant the use of armor, and tanks in particular, without the LST, it's hard to see how the Allies could have mounted an invasion of Europe at all. So they were big. They were also slow. They had a official top speed of 10 knots, though almost never did they manage to reach that speed. And given their critical importance to the invasion, they were also prime targets, so the sailors weren't wrong. The most important thing about the LSTs, however, was that they could steam right up onto the beach. Notice those seams right in front of the anchor on the bow of this. Those are essentially cupboard doors. When these vessels came to the beach, those doors could open up and the tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces could drive right out onto the sand. The problem was, in the spring of 1944, the Allies simply did not have enough of them. There were several reasons for this. First, though the American industrial production was awesome, even unprecedented, it was not infinite, and priorities had to be set. In setting those priorities, the Allies had to address the most immediate need. Remember the boy in the dam, put his fingers in the dike. In 1942, that meant producing Liberty ships and the escort ships necessarily to protect them as they crossed the Atlantic. Only late in 1943, with the U-boat threat not suppressed, but at least manageable, only then did the Allies switch construction priority from escorts and transports to LSTs. But changing a shipyard from building Liberty ships or escorts into building LSTs is not like throwing a switch. There are 30,000 component parts that go into the making of an LST, and the entire supply chain had to be reoriented to make that possible. By the spring of 1944, it had become evident that Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander of the invasion force, I love this particular photograph of him talking to the soldiers. It is duplicated, by the way, in the montage of photos just outside the entrance to this theater. Eisenhower was not going to have enough of them. And he wrote the Joint Chiefs in Washington to say so. He needed 271 more landing craft, he said, including 47 of the essential and scarce LSTs. He wrote George Marshall that without those LSTs, if he had to make the landing with those he had in hand, and those currently in the construction pipeline, if you add all that up together, and you assume a 90% effectiveness capability, which is kind of unrealistic, even then, the troops on the beach, and I'm going to quote him here, will have no, repeat, no LSTs reaching the beaches after the morning of D-Day +1 until the morning of D-Day +4. In other words, the troops on the beach would have no supply, reinforcement, or God forbid, the ability to extricate themselves for 3 days on the beach. Unacceptable. So D-Day was postponed. Originally scheduled for May 1st, it was moved to June 5th. Eventually, of course, it would happen on June 6th. As Ike put it in another message to Marshall, one extra month of landing craft production, including the LSTs, should help a lot. But even then, it was a near-run thing. Churchill, too, recognized where the bottleneck was. Everything turned on the landing craft, he wrote, which held our strategy in a tight ligature. All plans were in a straitjacket. And yet, that same week that Allied soldiers stormed ashore in Normandy, 11,000 miles away in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, an American invasion force nearly as large as the D-Day Armada, and including 84 of the scarce LSTs, headed for the island of Saipan in the Marianas. The fact that the Anglo-Americans could mount two enormous invasion armadas on opposite sides of the world at literally the same time shows first how the American industrial dynamo had changed the calculus of war from 1942 to 1944. 1942, when the loss of a dozen transport in Pedestal or the salvation of 18 of them off Guadalcanal might have made a difference in the war, and now to 1944, when we have thousands of ships to mount two operations at the same time. But second, it illustrates rather dramatically how the naval war was global, simultaneous, and interconnected. Ike would have salivated over those 84 LSTs. He could have gone in May after all, but they were in the Pacific. Instead of Germany first, instead of fighting one war at a time, the Allies by 1944 had become so strong they could fight in the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Mediterranean and the Arctic and the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean all at the same time. In short, the Second World War was a global war, one that involved a dozen national navies, which contested the seas in 6 oceans, everywhere except Antarctica, while fully acknowledging that all wars, including this one, are eventually won by boots on the ground. In constructing this book, I gained an enormous appreciation for how much the course of that war was charted and steered by maritime events. Now, you may have noticed that in this rather lengthy talk, I have not mentioned the Bismarck, Midway, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, lots of topics to talk about. But maybe we can do that during the Q&A period, which begins right now. Thank you very much. Okay, who's first?
Folks, if you have questions, you need to come to the microphones in the aisle.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Very interesting. Appreciate and look forward to reading the book. Can you talk a little bit about production from the perspective of prior to the U.S. entering the war, Liberty ships or other ship quantities being shipped to British forces and other forces in the world, and how that was distributed across a global perspective?
Yeah, I can. I mean, it's almost an American tradition that we enter wars underprepared and then gin up dramatically during the war to overwhelm the enemy with our productivity. That's a fair template of the American way of war, to steal a phrase from Russ Wagley. But I think President Roosevelt saw this coming. It was clear that he saw this coming in the 1930s, keeping an eye on Japan, trying to fend off Japan while he supplied Britain. And not only Lend-Lease, which we all know about, and the deal whereby we gave the British 50 old World War I vintage destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on Caribbean bases. In all of those ways, Roosevelt could see that the United States was likely to become involved. He could see that shipping was going to be crucial, and he created what he called a limited national emergency in 1939, before Pearl Harbor. He appointed Emery Scott Land, a retired admiral, to take charge of the War Shipping Administration, to ramp up the number of ships built. The United States had never built more than 1 million tons of shipping in its history in a year. He told Land he wanted 7 million tons. And this is before the war. And then he wanted 13 million tons after the war. And then George C. Marshall came to him and said, well, that's not really going to be enough. You know, if you really expect us to launch this invasion of occupied France, we're going to need more than that. And it ended up telling Land he needed 15 million tons of shipping in 1943. Well, that number was so huge as to become almost a laughingstock. But it is true that even before the war, I think Roosevelt was something of a visionary to see that shipping, not just warships, not just the ships authorized by the so-called Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940, which was passed unanimously, 316 to nothing by Congress in 1940. I challenge you, by the way, to think of a bill that would pass Congress unanimously today. Those ships would be the ones that came online in late 1943 and formed the heart of the invasions for D-Day and Saipan. But in addition to that, the transport shipping that Roosevelt saw was going to be necessary to carry out a global war in multiple oceans. So even before the war began, he began laying the groundwork for that. And that required, of course, the acquisition of new shipping yards and building ways and other things down the line. So, yes, thank you. Who's next? Yes, sir.
Oh, hello, Craig.
Hello.
My question is, in all your research in this vast scale, and you've got all the principal countries, the navies, were there any, when you're doing your research, any head scratching as, why the hell did you guys do what you just did?
Oh,
And
infinite
then,
number.
Could you break it down to individual navies if you have several? Please?
Well, I think the thing that Americans tend to overlook is the important roles played by navies like the Dutch. I mean, most Americans would scratch their heads and say, wait a minute, the Dutch had a navy? Holland, of course, the Netherlands, had been overrun by the German war machine in 1940 as part of the great sweep westward when France fell in the summer of 1940. But the government of France, Queen Wilhelmina, Churchill used to joke that of all the crowned heads of Europe, Queen Wilhelmina was the only man among them. Queen Wilhelmina escaped with her government to Britain to carry on a government in exile, and the Dutch East Indies, their colonies in south of the South China Sea, had a pretty significant surface force of cruisers and destroyers. And because several nations were fighting against one opponent, the Allies cobbled together a unified command known as ABDA. Americans, British, Dutch, and Australians, and put a British general in charge of it. Well, the naval component of that, the ABDA strike force, was commanded by a Dutch admiral, Karl Doorman, who fought several battles, critical battles against the Japanese. Now, this is not a laugh line. He lost them all, but they were tragic, desperate attempts to slow down the Japanese juggernaut. And I think Americans often overlook that. I think the role of the Canadian Navy in doing a lot of the escort duty across the North Atlantic in these tiny little called Flower-class corvettes. So small, they were less than 1,000 tons, 900 tons. They bobbed around like corks in the ocean. You could hardly step on board one without getting seasick. But they carried a lot of the burden of the escort duty on that convoy, and that's unsung work. I mean, we remember Midway and Leyte Gulf and Iwo Jima, but the Dutch Navy, the Canadian escorts, and others like that, they sometimes don't get the credit they deserve, and I tried to give them that in this book. I'm not sure that's responsive to your question, but that's what I'm going with. So, yes, sir.
Yes, I appreciate your emphasis on the industrial might of the United States and the role it played in the Navy in World War II. I was talking recently with a retired naval architect who told me that when he was designing ships, such as the carrier Enterprise, back in the 50s and 60s, everything was domestic, all the components. He said, by the time I retired, we could not build a ship with domestics. We had to use imported goods to build ships. Does that concern you at all?
It does not, and I'll explain why. When I began this afternoon, I said that World War II was transformative, that it changed the world. And one of the ways it changed the world was that it made the world a global community economically as well as politically. The Bretton Woods Conference that did currency balancing, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, that were all part of the post-war accommodation of the Allies setting up the world for the next many generations in the hope that there would never be another global conflict like the two that had ravaged the 20th century. And because of that, the world became interconnected. It is possible to look at World War II and say, boy, could we ever do that again? Could we ever ramp up in a crisis like that from 1 million tons to 15 million tons in just a couple of years? And the concern was, well, some of those component parts would have to come from overseas, and doesn't that create an uncomfortable dependency? But it's an interdependency. It's a global dependency. And in a way, that contributes to the unlikelihood that there ever will be another global conflagration involving 72 belligerent nations all at war with one another at the same time. So it does not bother me. I'm still confident that America has the economic resiliency to meet a crisis when it emerges. So I guess I'm going to stop with that one. I'm less concerned than the mere fact that many of our weapon systems have goods that are not domestically produced implies a dependency and perhaps a weakness that I think is not accurate. We're pretty tough. I like to tell this story when I talk to audiences about the Navy today, and that is that if you take one of those nuclear-powered aircraft carriers like your friend worked on, and the accompanying strike force that goes with it, usually a couple of guided missile cruisers and a handful of frigates and destroyers, supporting ships, tankers for the destroyers to feed the destroyers, and a few submarines under the water as well, that strike force has more striking power in itself than the entire Navy of any other nation on earth. And we have 10 of them. So we're okay, right? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I want to thank you for a very interesting talk. I always have to say I'm not from the United States, I'm from the Caribbean, so I think you can figure out...
I'm glad I mentioned the Caribbean then.
Thank you for that. Two things in the Caribbean. I'm from the so-called French Dutch Caribbean, a small island, St. Martin. But during World War II, there were two islands, Aruba and Curacao, in the southern part, just off Venezuela, who had oil refineries, et cetera, and it is continually, I mean, from the time I'm small, I'm hearing these stories, that early on, the Germans had tried to basically attack these two places. So maybe you want to talk about that, maybe talk something more about the Caribbean. The second issue would be, indeed, since World War II, we really haven't had a great naval battle, right? I mean, Falkland Islands, et cetera, but that's... What would you think, coming out of World War II, was 1, 2, or 3 significant and crucial lessons that all of the big naval powers in the world learned from that war, and how do you see that playing out going forward? You know, with AI, computerization, kind of making, who knows, ships eventually drive themselves, float themselves, direct themselves. How do you see that playing out? Thank you very much.
This book is 800 pages long, and I'd have to write another one to answer all of those questions, but let me give it a shot. Let me start with the Caribbean. Aruba and Curacao were not only sources of oil, but they had refinery facilities. A lot of the ships on the North Atlantic convoys that carried fuel, and particularly aviation fuel, high-octane, 100-octane aviation fuel across the North Atlantic, originated at Curacao, including the cargo carried by the Ohio in Operation Pedestal. So they were important sites, and the Germans, of course, knew this. And when the United States became a belligerent in December of 1941, Hitler finally gave permission to Admiral Raeder, who passed that down to Admiral Dönitz, to release his U-boats to attack the United States, which Dönitz had been arguing for months. The United States had been escorting British convoys in violation of its neutral status, and Dönitz wanted to attack them, and Hitler said, no, I got to defeat the Soviets first. But after Pearl Harbor, oh hell, go ahead. So Dönitz, who did not have as many submarines as he would like to have had, sent 9 or so over to the American coast. And for a while, in early 1942, there was devastation off the American coast, particularly around Cape Hatteras. When the United States finally got the wherewithal together to put coastal convoys together, the submarines moved further south into here it comes, the Caribbean. And that became the central front in the U-boat war against the tanker trade. Not only for those who loaded up at Curacao, but those who loaded up in Louisiana and East Texas. There were not the pipelines then in place that would carry the oil overland, or the railroad capability to carry the oil. Almost all of the oil from East Texas and Louisiana, where much of it was pumped, came around the double coast of Florida and up the east coast of the United States in tankers. And that was the target of Dunitz's U-boat. So the Caribbean was in March and April of 1942 probably one of the deadliest places on the Earth's surface for tankers. So that was one. What was the second one? No, there was one before that. There was one. Big battles. Big battles since World War II. The biggest surface engagement since Leyte Gulf took place in the Persian Gulf in 1988, April 18th, 1988, when the Iranian Navy, the Revolutionary Guard element of the Iranian Navy, sortied against the United States Navy. Two guided missile cruisers and a gunboat were attacked by the Iranian Navy. In missile warfare, it's the first confrontation about missile warfare. That's why I wanted to bring it up. You know, you think of World War I, where naval engagements was by big guns, huge guns, could fire a 2,000-pound shell 20 miles. Then in World War II, the range grows even further. Now, instead of 20 miles, you can fire essentially from 200 miles by bombs and torpedoes carried by aircraft launched off an aircraft carrier. In the Persian Gulf in 1988, the dominant form of warfare became missiles fired from 500 miles away over a longer range. And now, of course, you can sit in MacDill Air Force Base at a little console with a little set of controls and fire a Hellfire missile from a drone at a target 14,000 miles away. So the characteristic change in naval warfare is the distance at which the opponents fight. In the age of sail, you had to steam up. You had to sail up to within half pistol shot, 50 yards, 60 yards away. You'd come hull to hull and blast away with smooth-bore iron cannonballs. But then gradually over time, the range and the accuracy increased. And the big difference between World War I and II was from the gun to the airplane. And from World War II to now, it's the emergence of electronic and missile warfare that increases the range to such a point that there's almost no theater anymore. You can target an enemy from the Persian Gulf or the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean. You don't even have to be in the same ocean anymore to target that foe, because they're guided by satellites overhead and they're conducted by geosynchronous units and they have terrain following capability. It's pretty awesome stuff. So that's the future. That's what midshipmen at the Naval Academy are studying now. They just created a new major at the Naval Academy. The Admiral and I were talking about his selection of a major when he was a plebe back in 1977. The newest major at the Naval Academy, you want to guess? Cyber warfare, you bet. Yeah, that's what it is. Very popular, I understand, too. Okay, who's next? I'm sorry. I took so long you had to sit down. That's only fair.
I think this discussion would have been quite different if it was a British admiral talking about the world at war at sea. He would have emphasized heavily the British Navy and the big battles with the German battleships, because by the time America actually got more involved in the war in 42, a lot of those big battles had already kind of happened. So a British admiral would have had a very different perspective on the world war at sea, just because of how much their navy was affected by these big German battleships. And of course, we heavily bombed them, but the Brits heavily bombed them, but they really took a large brunt of the war by the German battleships. And I just wanted to make that point, because
fair is fair.
Yes.
Let's talk about the Royal Navy. By the way, I'll just, for fun, tease you about there is no British Navy. Did you know that? There's a British Army, but it's a Royal Navy. It dates back to the English Civil War, when the Navy stayed loyal to the King, to King Charles, but the Army went over to Cromwell. So it's the British Army representing the people of Britain, but the Royal Navy. I don't know what the excuse of the Royal Air Force is, but that's there. In any case, you're right. The Royal Navy plays an important role, and we need to give credit where credit is due, and that is to the fact 3 things won this war. The British willingness, ability to hang in there from June of 1940, when France was defeated and they carried the burden of this war by themselves, until June of 1941, when Hitler stupidly invaded the Soviet Union. For those 12 months, Britain is the only ally fighting alone against the Wehrmacht and the German war machine. And we can't forget that. Absent the British, none of this happens. Second, the Red Army. The Red Army spilled out its blood on the steppes of Ukraine and of Russia profligately. You know, the Americans lost 350,000 killed in this war. That's a terrible loss. The Russians lost 20 million. So let's not lose sight of that. The third thing is the one I emphasize today, and that is American industrial productivity. All 3 of those were essential to the outcome. I will, however, say this about the Royal Navy's role when it was fighting the war alone, before the United States got into this. The key problem was not German battleships. They had 2 of them. They had the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. The Bismarck actually got to sea, but as we all know, it never got back. And it never got back because the Royal Navy chased it down, tracked it down, wounded it, and then killed it and sent it to the bottom. The Tirpitz got to sea briefly, but was chased back into port and was bombed into submission and eventual capitulation by the Royal Air Force. So yeah, the German battleships, the 2 big German battleships, are neutralized by the Royal Navy without help from the United States. Thank you very much. And the British bore the burden of protecting those North Atlantic convoys through that crucial first year of the war. And absent that, all the rest of this is moot. So you're absolutely right on that, and a point worth making. But I will argue with you in this respect. I think if a British admiral got up here to talk to an American audience, he'd probably emphasize the role of the Americans too. And when I was teaching at the British Naval Academy, which I did, I emphasized the British role there too. Okay.
Craig, I'm afraid we're out of time.
All right, I'm sorry everybody, we're out of time. Thank you very much, I appreciate it.